Hi. Just waiting for some people to come online. If you can hear me, say something. Hello, John. If you can give me a thumbs up or a heart, just to let me know that you can hear me okay. And you'll have to excuse me itching. I've got a thing called folliculitis, which I'm on antibiotics for, but it causes me to itch. So I'm very sorry. Hi Constance, how are you? Hear you now. Your mute button was on. That would have confused me if you'd said that you couldn't hear me, because I wouldn't know what to do. We'll wait another minute for people to get online. All right. Yeah. Okay. That was my wife who doesn't want to be seen. Hiya, George. Here and good from Germany. Awesome. Well, today we're gonna continue with our look at David, and if there are any of you who want me to do a study on anybody in particular, just let me know. Next week I think we're gonna do the Judges, the book of Judges, focusing on Samson, Ruth and Gideon, so that should be interesting. But we'll see how that goes. Well, I'm really sorry. My head is really itchy, and please forgive me for itching all the time. When we get to David at this point, David is at the peak of his power. He's effectively king of the world. He's done everything, seen everybody. Relax. I will try. He's done everything, and he's in a position of absolute power. He's conquered most of the known world. He's absolutely untouchable. And then one afternoon it all goes wrong. While the army is away fighting a battle, which David should have been leading, David was basically, the only thing that comes to mind was he was getting complacent, and he was just couldn't be bothered to go out and fight, so he sent his men out to fight, and he stayed home because he felt like staying home, which was abdicating his duties to a big extent. And when you can't be bothered with your duties, then things go wrong, and things happen, such as happened to David. And a woman who was staying in the house next door thought all the men were away, so she had a bath on the roof, which you would if all if all of the men at that you are aware of go away to war, you would assume that the only person who could overlook your house, would be the king. You would assume that the king would have gone with them, but he didn't, and that in essence was David's downfall, was the fact that he abdicated his responsibility. He abdicated the responsibility he had to his men, to his country, to his people, and he just couldn't be bothered, so he stayed home. And David saw her, and her name was Bathsheba, which I'm sure most of you would know. And it happened sometime after David was proclaimed king, that he was taking a stroll on the rooftops, and he beheld this beautiful woman named Bathsheba. David, inquiring about the woman, was informed that she was married to a soldier named Uriah. Now, at this point, this is the second point at which David should have pulled back and thought, she's married, she's untouchable, she's out of things, and to make it even more, make her even more untouchable, she was married to one of David's main men. Uriah was an amazing fighter and an amazing ally of David's, but that didn't stop David. And basically, we gain from this that David was, for want of a better word, a bit of a womanizer. David's passion for Bathsheba was strong, and he wished to have her, and he sent for her, and they had sex. And we're not told how many times they had sex or how long the war lasted, but David got her pregnant, and it's at that point that he panics, and he doesn't take it to God. All of this is done within man's strength and within man's ability to make decisions, which is pretty bad for the majority of the time. So he gets her pregnant, and he thinks, what can I do? So he sends for Uriah to come back from the front line, knowing full well what he was going to do. And he sends for Uriah, and he does everything that he can to try and get him to sleep with his wife. But Uriah is an honourable man. Uriah won't even go and stay in his wife's house while his men are out on the front line fighting. And we see a vast difference here between David and Uriah. David was basically enjoying himself, having a jolly, couldn't be bothered about his men, and yet Uriah was in charge of far less men than David, and yet he was conscious of his men. How could he go and sleep with his wife when they can't go and sleep with their wives? And there's this real dichotomy of reasoning between the two men. Uriah was acting like the king should have acted, and David was acting basically like a right scoundrel. Well, David eventually couldn't get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba, so David arranges for him to be put on the front line, and for the soldiers to basically pull back and leave Uriah in the fray to die, and that again was tantamount to killing him himself, and he basically was trying to rectify his mistake rather than coming clean. He was trying to rectify his mistake, and he was digging himself a bigger and bigger hole. And how many times do we do that? How many times do we try and rectify a mistake that we've made and dig ourselves into a bigger hole, instead of taking it to God and say, look, I've made a mistake, please rectify it in the best way that you see fit. David is at this point where he's about to have a man killed, and he goes through with it, and he has Uriah killed. When the news of Uriah's death reached David, he took Bathsheba as his wife, and the whole town, the whole city basically knew what had happened, and they weren't best pleased. And it's at this point that you start seeing a shift. You start seeing that point of people starting to not trust David, and starting to the fall of David, the decline of David's empire starts from there. God was pleased with David's actions. God was not pleased with David's actions. God shouldn't be pleased with David's actions, and sent the prophet Nathan to rebuke him. Nathan basically tells David a story about a wealthy landowner basically having loads of sheep, and this one landowner next to him having one sheep, and the wealthy landowner has somebody come into to the property, and he wants to honour them, so he pinches the sheep off the one person and kills it, and this is basically the story of David. He's got 17 wives, countless concubines, and yet he goes and pinches Uriah's wife. Uriah only has one wife, and David has many of them. And David's response to this is, well, I'd put the wealthy landowner to death. And Nathan says, the wealthy landowner is you. You have done this. You have dishonoured God and dishonoured the memory of Uriah. You've dishonoured people. And knowing that he had sinned, David sat in penance until God forgave him. And here we see a different side to David. David has had this this manly section in his life where he has just listened to his flesh, and he realizes that he's just listened to his flesh, and he is contrite. He's racked with guilt, and he asks God to forgive him, and stays in that manner until God does forgive him. This story raises many questions that are beyond the scope of what we're gonna do here, but a couple of points need to be addressed in order to bring clarity to this story. The first is, what on earth was in David's head? We can't comprehend what David was going through. Was he bored without his mates around? Was he just overcome with lust? What on earth was in David's head? And according to the Talmud, the reason King David sought to marry Bathsheba and was willing to go to great lengths to do so was because he saw by divine inspiration that he would be destined to marry her and bear the next king of Israel. Furthermore, before sending Uriah off to battle, he had a quick discussion with him regarding the war, in the midst of which King David gave Uriah a command to go home, and a command that Uriah did not obey. And he didn't obey it because he thought it would be unfair to his men. He told the king, the Ark of Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Joab and your majesty's men are camped in the open. How can I go home? So Uriah was, for all David's for want of a better word, good intentions here, and they weren't really good intentions. They were just David trying to cover his tracks. Uriah was a man of his word. Referring to Joab, David's general, as my master in front of the king was tantamount to treason, and Uriah deserved the death penalty for his rebellion. However, King David sentenced him to death under the guise of sending him to war, so people should not say King David and Uriah had Uriah killed so that he could take his wife. Well, they couldn't as such say that, but the people knew what had happened, and it very quickly spread around. Justified though his actions may have been, they still displeased God. And Nathan the prophet, as I said, informed the king that his first child he had with Bathsheba would die as a consequence of his actions. Now imagine the place that David was in now. He's committed this act, or these acts. He's asked God for forgiveness, which he's got. And then the prophet comes to him and says, by the way, your first child will die because of your direct actions. That would be hard for any parent. And knowing that, even when the baby was in the womb, knowing that you're going to bring a child into existence knowing that that child is going to die shortly must have been heart-wrenching for David. But there was nothing that he could do with it. This was all of his own making. And we'll see in the future that further down the line that so many things altered at this point. Shortly after this, Bathsheba gave birth to a boy who fell critically ill, and David fasted and prayed in the hope of rescinding God's decree. But alas, on the 7th day, the baby passed away. David accepted this as part of his penance, and he got up from his fasting and prostrated before God. Now, there were lots of people who were rather confused at this. They were confused in the fact that David was fasting and praying before the baby's death, but as soon as the baby died, David gave up the fasting and praying. And the reason that David gave up the fasting and praying was because there wasn't any point anymore. David had realized that God had enacted his vengeance for what David had done, and that was the end of it. That day, or over that period of the days, David broke 5 out of the 10 commandments. And as I've said in my talk on Exodus, the 10 commandments is like a necklace of 10 beads. And once you've broken one, you've destroyed the set. So to break 5 of them was just as good as breaking 10. He coveted his neighbour's wife. He bore false witness against her husband. He stole the wife. He committed adultery with her. And he arranged the murder of her husband. And even though David didn't kill Uriah himself, he might as well have. He put him in a position where Uriah was definitely going to die. And he did that knowingly. It's a terrible, terrible story. And from that afternoon, where David spied Bathsheba over on her rooftop, everything went downhill. And over the next 500 years, basically Israel lost everything that God had given them. And for a year, David hid the guilt of this action in his heart. He had a guilty conscience. Read Psalm 32, and it will state about David's guilty conscience. And it's during this time that he wrote Psalm 51, and it's a psalm of confession. David cried out to God and said, "Please don't take your Holy Spirit away from me, and create in me a clean heart." He'd watched Saul having the Holy Spirit taken away from him, and he'd watched him have this hole in his life which a demon stepped into, and Saul was tormented in that, and David didn't want that for himself. And besides that, he realistically had a heart for God. He'd just done this terrible, terrible thing, and he confessed he was born a sinner. And then Nathan the prophet confronted him with this parable which he had done. He made Bathsheba pregnant and her husband killed. And all of this all snowballed. But Bathsheba becomes pregnant again, and with a son called Solomon. Now Solomon wasn't the first in line to the kingdom, but David knew that Solomon had to be next in line. David and Bathsheba gave birth to the son called Solomon, and Solomon means the peaceful, whom Nathan the prophet blessed him in the name of God, called Jedediah, the beloved of God. Solomon was destined to rule over Israel. King David was now a disgraced man, and this disgrace led to a disintegration of his family. David had a number of sons, three of whom, Absalom, Adoniah, and Solomon, became prominent in the history of Israel. Where his eldest son, the eldest of his sons, Adoniah, raped one of his sisters. We have the story in the Bible of Adoniah basically tricking one of his sisters to come in and then forcing her to sleep with him. And Absalom found out about this, and he waited 2 years until he killed Adoniah, his eldest son. And then Absalom went into hiding. He actually went to his grandparents, which was another kingdom. So Absalom was a handsome, ambitious, and charismatic prince. He believed that he was destined to be king and feared that his elderly father would pass the crown onto the young Solomon, as King David was divinely inspired to do. And so he rallied some of the greatest warriors and advisors and led a revolt against his father. Basically, Absalom waited for 2 years, and then the king invited him sort of back into his court, but not allowing him to actually see the king. And it was a year after he came back into his court that until he saw David. And in that period of time, Absalom would sit out by the gates of David's castle, and he would sort out disputes for people. So the people started turning to Absalom and really liking him. And Absalom slowly got a number of people on his side and eventually led a revolt against his father. News of the revolt broke David's heart, and instead of confronting his son in all-out war, he fled with some of his loyal servants. Here's I'm not sure what scripture that is, Constance. I'll look it up and put it in the comments. I'm I'm not very good with chapter and verse, and I was never very good with chapter and verse. And since I've had the stroke, I'm even worse. So I'll I'll look it up and put it in the comments for you. News of this revolt, as I said, broke David's heart, and instead of confronting his son-in-law at war, David fled on foot. Here's David fleeing again, because he doesn't want to kill his king, his son, and he's more bothered about that than anything. David wept up at the Mount of Olives. Then Absalom did a terrible thing. On the advice of one of his advisors, he took David's wives and paraded them on the palace roof, where everyone could see them, and then he had sex with them in public. And this was a complete desecration of David's line, but it was also a complete desecration of everything that the Jewish people held dear to them. And Absalom showed in that instance that he didn't care about God, and he didn't care about the things of God, and he was just out for power. Absalom was determined to chase his father David down, and a bloody battle ensued. Realizing that his father had the upper hand, Absalom fled in terror and dismay. As he rides through the woods on a swift mule, his long locks of hair get caught in a spreading branch of a large tree. Unable to extract himself, he remained suspended, for his mule had escaped. One of David's servants brought this intelligence to Joab, King David's general, who gave the order that Absalom was to be put to death. Even though Absalom had caused great troubles for his father, King David nonetheless grieved and mourned for the death of his son. Unfortunately, Absalom was not the only son to seek the throne. But in this mourning, King David mourned so much for his son that the troops came back to town under a sort of cloud, and it took his general to go up to David and say, look, if you don't thank your troops for doing this, they're going to desert you, because it looks like you cared more about the person that they've just defeated than them. And so David thanked his troops. Adoniah also had grand plans to obtain the crown, but King David put an immediate halt to any other usurpers by having Solomon anointed and pronounced King of Israel. Adoniah was basically in the process of announcing himself king at the time that David anointed Solomon. Adoniah had taken it upon himself to invite all these dignitaries to a big meal, and then he finds out whilst he's having this big meal that that Solomon has been anointed king. Then the whole nation became disgruntled. They were all grumbling about the behaviour of the royal children. There was a tension that ultimately led to the empire's downfall. Then Satan tempted David by saying, "How many people do you reign over?" And David counted God's people. David was counting them for pride. There was nothing wrong with counting the people, but God hadn't said to count his people. And David was counting them for pride in terms of, look how many people I am ruler over. He just wanted to know how big he was. And it brought a plague on Israel. And that plague was only stopped when David cried out to the Lord. One thing David had done was return the ark to Jerusalem. When David danced in front of the ark, his wife couldn't stand it and she ridiculed David, and she asked him what was he doing. He was a king. And David said, yeah, but this is equivalent to my king entering our land. So David danced, and he danced almost naked. And from that day on, that wife had no children. David bought the threshing floor to build God's temple, but God wouldn't allow him to build the temple because he had blood on his hands. It wasn't a matter of David had killed loads and loads of people, and that's not the blood that God was bothered about. God was bothered about the blood of Uriah on David's hands, and that was the reason why he wasn't allowed to build the temple. It had to be built by a man of peace, Samuel. David got the plans drawn up, he got the men together, and he got the materials, but he was never allowed to build the temple. For years, David only had God to talk to or sing to when he was in the wilderness, when Saul was chasing him. And all those years were preparation for him to become the most powerful man in Israel. King David was not just another figure in history. He lives on to this day. One of King David's greatest works, and arguably his greatest legacy, was the Book of Psalms, which is about 75% written by David. During his spare time, King David would study the Torah and sing songs of praise to God. The Book of Psalms has been a refuge for the Jewish people in their times of trouble throughout history. Whenever Jews are in distress, they open up the Book of Psalms and cry out to God. Any decision that David had to make, he always inquired of the Lord. And you see this constantly in the book of Samuel. It says constantly David inquired of the Lord. And that's what the Lord appreciated, was David's heart. And apart from the very big blip, David's heart was always for the Lord. He was unhappy when his enemies were killed. He was furious because one of Saul's sons was killed. Even though Saul had been his enemy, he was a very, very forgiving man. And he would honour brave people. In the book of Samuel, there is a list of people whom David honoured. Even when David made a flippant comment about wanting a drink of water from a fountain in Jerusalem, and 3 of his best soldiers snuck into the city to get David what he wanted. That gives you an idea of how revered David was. It was a flippant comment. It was something along the lines of, "Oh, I wish I could have a drink from the fountain in Jerusalem now," but there's no chance. Jerusalem's fortified and under somebody else's rule. And 3 of his best soldiers sneak in under cover of darkness to get him what he wanted. And when they gave it to David, David was overcome. He couldn't actually drink it because he realized that his soldiers could have been killed just for a flippant word of his. And hiya, Charlie. And he honoured them for that. And he honoured them for what they had done. David made a list of his brave friends, just the opposite of Saul. He loved honouring other people, whereas Saul, if Saul thought somebody had done something good, he'd get them out of the way, because Saul was so bothered about what other people said and what other people thought, and David was only bothered about honouring people. And David saw that God was a living king. At the age of 70, David passed away, and it's said that before his death he asked God to reveal exactly what he would leave this world. God, not wishing to divulge this information, merely informed him on which day of the week let me start that again. David asked God when he would leave this world, and God, not wishing to divulge that information, merely told him on which day of the week he was going to die, and that was on Shabbat. David made sure to be constantly studying the Torah throughout every Shabbat, so that the angel of death would not be able to take his soul. When David's time came to an end, the angel of death distracted the king from his reading and from his learning by shaking the trees in the garden. The king climbed the stairs to see what the commotion was about, but one of the steps broke underneath his feet. Startled, the king paused from his studies, and it was that moment that the king passed away. Saul, David, and Solomon each reigned in Israel for 40 years. God made a special covenant with David, and he'd made a covenant as he'd made a covenant with Abraham and Moses. David was embarrassed, and he'd built such a palace for himself, and yet God was living in a tent. So he determined to build God a house, but as we said, God wouldn't allow him. God replied to him when he said to God about building him a tent with 3 words to the prophet Nathan: go ahead, don't do it, which is completely contradictory. And then God said, a tent is good enough for me, which shows in a way God's humility. And since when did I ask for a palace? It was a dig at David, in a sense. Did you really need all the palaces and all the adulation and all the wives? And finally, God said, you can build it because you can't build it because your hands are full of blood, but your son can build it for me. He will be a man of peace. And Solomon never fought any wars or battles in his life. And then comes the covenant between God and David. God says, I'll treat your sons as my son. I'll flog him, but I'll never cease to love him. And then it comes to the great promise. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. I will build a permanent royal house for you, David. And for one reason why David's descendants always kept records of their family tree was that they were waiting for the son of David to appear. And you can constantly see the records of David's household kept throughout the Bible. For years, when a boy was born, they would run out into the streets and shout, David! It's a boy, and it may be David. 1,000 years later, this covenant was fulfilled, and Jesus was born to a simple family who loved God and who'd kept their family tree. And both Joseph and Mary were direct descendants of King David. And so legitimately and legally, Jesus was the son of David through Joseph, his father. And physically, he was the son of David through his mother. So he was twice over the son of David. Jesus was often called Son of David, and he reigns for always and forever, the risen Lord. When God makes a promise, he keeps it. Jesus was King of the Jews, and he was born and he died King of the Jews. He's King of the church. He's our King. He should be ruling his church, and so often he seems to be crying out to us, give me back my church. And this is a point which is really difficult, because we seem to have put aside Jesus in some ways in our churches. We don't do what he says, but we are Sunday Christians, and we don't do the things that Jesus said. We don't give our food to the homeless. We don't give the people who need clothing, and we don't do lots of things. We don't actually see other people as Christ. And I think that's what Jesus meant when he was talking about this. We've got to go around seeing other people as a form of Christ, because Jesus died for everybody, and everybody means everybody. It doesn't say that Jesus only died for this group or that group or the other group. It says that Jesus died for everybody. And even though not everybody is going to come to know Christ, we've got to see everybody as Christ. We've got to see the homeless person as Christ, see the alcoholic as Christ. We've got to see the drug addict as Christ, the prostitute as Christ. And we have got to be the same. And we've got to show them love and show them that we would treat our neighbour as we would want to be treated, as we would treat ourselves. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that the church doesn't do. I'm not saying every church by a long stretch, but we so often hear about, and in my ministry I hear about it a lot, that the people are looked down on when they go into church. People are asked to leave churches. People who go into churches and are smelly or have a mental illness or something, people move away from them, so they end up sitting isolated in a church full of people, isolated in their own basically meaning that they are made to sit on their own, and it's wrong. It's Jesus accepted everybody. He accepted the people who were smelly and naked and all sorts, and Jesus just accepted them for who they were, because Jesus accepts us for who we are, and it's at that point that he meets us, and then we start effecting a change. It's not a matter of we change first. The last question the disciples asked Jesus when he ascended to heaven was, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel at this time? And he didn't say, that's a silly question. He said, it's not for you to know the date the Father has fixed, which basically means it is going to happen. So at the end of days, the kingdom of Israel is going to be put back up there. And one day, Jesus will reign on the earth as King of the Jews, and he's also going to reign as King of the world and King of us. And we are going to rule with him. And all that comes out of the book of Samuel and the covenant that God made with David. And our future is all wrapped up with that covenant. And it's amazing to me that we don't read about these Bible characters more often. Charlie was saying, I think it's interesting to look at Bible characters' lives, and that's one of the reasons why I've chosen to sort of concentrate on characters, and it's a matter of we so often take bits of the Bible. We so often take bits of the Bible, and we take bits out of Jesus's life, and bits out of David's life, and bits out of Solomon and Saul, and we don't actually look at the whole life and what were the ups and downs. That there were only two effectively perfect lives led in the Bible, and that was Jesus and Joseph. And hi Eric, it's a matter of when people look at the Bible, they only take snippets, and it's good to look at a whole. It's good to read a book in its entirety. And the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is the story of King Saul and King David, the first two kings of Israel, and there's such a difference between the two. As I said, Saul was all about where people would, and he was so bothered about how people were perceiving him, and David basically couldn't give a damn. He would do whatever God told him to do. We see that when David was going to face Goliath, it was all the convention was thrown out the window. David did this constantly throughout his life. All convention was thrown out of the window, and he just did what God told him to do until that time when he did what his flesh told him to do, and he went and slept with Bathsheba. And it's, you can see the rise and rise and rise of David up until that point, and then at that point you start seeing the decline. And it wasn't just a decline for David, it was a decline for the whole of Israel. And it went up a little bit with Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man in the known world, and he basically had people coming from all over the world to see him. But once again, Solomon succumbed to the flesh. Solomon with Solomon, it was a matter of he had so many wives when God had told him not to take wives outside of the Jewish faith, and he had so many wives, and they basically persuaded him to worship other gods. And by the time Solomon was an old man, Solomon was worshipping all sorts of gods, including Molech, who is one of the most abhorrent gods in the known world. And we see even this man of absolute wisdom couldn't keep his mind on things. He had to have his mind unsettled by the flesh, and it was at that point we'd seen it, the people of Israel coming downwards, and then they made a little upwards turn with Solomon, and then they came downwards again, and that was effectively the last real upwards trend, and effectively they just went downwards for 1,000 years. And it's terrible to see the decline of a civilization to such a degree. They went from having everything in the world with King David to having nothing in the world and being slaves, and they were slaves to the Philistines, to Rome, to Greece, all sorts of people. And once they'd been kings of the world, it's a terrible thing to see. But it all started going downhill when David took his eyes off God and put his eyes onto the flesh, and the flesh basically took David's feet away from him and brought him down and down and down. Well, next time we're gonna study, gonna do take a look at the book of Judges with the judges which were put in place, namely Gideon, Ruth, and Samson. So God bless, and may God go with you everywhere. Amen.